There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a palace before a king enters a room. It is not peace, it is preparation. Every woman in that space has already calculated, in the space of a breath, exactly how to stand, how to lower her eyes, how to smile without smiling too much. We begin in England. The year is 1509. The palace is Richmond, and then Greenwich, and then Westminster. The geography matters less than what happens inside it. Henry VIII has just turned 18 and ascended the throne. He is, by every account of the time, extraordinarily beautiful. Tall, broad-shouldered, red-haired, with a voice trained for music and a mind educated by the best scholars in Europe. People who meet him for the first time are startled. They expect a king. They do not expect this. And into this world steps Catherine of Aragon. She is 23, Spanish by birth, and she has already been in England for 8 years, long enough to know how cold the winters are, how inconsistent the court is, and how much of her life has been spent waiting. She was first married to Henry's older brother Arthur, who died within months of their wedding. For years after that, she existed in a kind of suspended state, neither fully wife nor fully widow, caught between two kingdoms that argued over her dowry while she prayed in her chambers and wore the same dresses until they frayed at the cuffs. When Henry finally married her, she was not surprised. She was relieved. Catherine was, by temperament and training, a queen. She spoke Latin, French, and Spanish. She had read theology and governance. She wore gowns of rich crimson and gold. She kept her dark hair dressed under elaborate hoods in the Spanish fashion. And she carried herself with the kind of stillness that comes not from passivity, but from discipline. She had learned, very young, that a woman's dignity is the one thing no one can take if she refuses to give it. For nearly 2 decades, she and Henry ruled together. She managed the household, corresponded with ambassadors, and during Henry's war campaign in France in 1513, she governed England as regent and oversaw the English victory at the Battle of Flodden. She sent Henry the bloodied coat of the Scottish king as proof. She was not, by any measure, a woman waiting in a tower. And yet, something in the court was shifting. The silence before the king entered a room was beginning to sound different. Anne Boleyn arrived at the English court in 1522, having spent years in France, first in the service of Mary Tudor and then at the French court itself. She was not what people expected. She was not conventionally beautiful in the manner of the time, which prized fairness and softness. She was dark-eyed, long-necked, sharp-featured, and magnetic. She wore her hair loose at times, draped over her shoulders in a way that was considered bold. She dressed extravagantly, deep greens, yellows, black. And she favored French fashions that carried a different energy than the heavier Spanish formality of Catherine's court. She moved with the self-possession of someone who had grown up watching power operate close up and had decided to understand it rather than fear it. She also read. She owned a French Bible annotated in her own hand. She engaged with the early ideas of the Reformation and discussed theology with men who found her, by their own accounts, unexpectedly formidable in argument. Henry fell into obsession with Anne somewhere around 1526. His letters to her, 17 of which survive, are remarkable not for their restraint, but for the complete lack of it. A king of England wrote, in his own hand, of suffering for her, of his heart belonging entirely to her, of his willingness to wait. She made him wait for 7 years. This is the detail that most accounts mention, but few linger on. For 7 years, Anne Boleyn refused to become Henry's mistress. She had watched what happened to her own sister, Mary, who had been the king's lover and had been set aside with nothing but a quiet marriage to a minor courtier. Anne understood that the only position with any durability was queen, so she held her ground. During those 7 years, Henry broke with Rome, dismantled the authority of the Catholic Church in England, dissolved his marriage to Catherine, and invented an entirely new religious and legal structure for his kingdom, not only because he wanted a son, but because a woman with dark eyes and a French-educated mind had decided her value was not negotiable. Catherine of Aragon, during this period, was sent away from court. She was separated from her daughter Mary. She refused, until her last breath, to call herself anything other than queen. She died in January 1536 at Kimbolton Castle, cold, ill, and isolated, still signing her letters, Catherine the Queen. Her dignity had cost her everything. She had paid it anyway. Anne became queen in 1533. She was pregnant. Her coronation procession through London was watched by enormous crowds, some hostile, some curious. She entered Westminster Abbey wearing crimson velvet and ermine. She was already beginning to understand what Catherine had always known, that the crown is not protection. It is a target. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the court itself, not as a place of glamour, but as a machine. It operated on proximity. The closer you were to the king, the more power you had, and the more dangerous your position became. Ladies-in-waiting slept near the queen's chamber. They dressed her, undressed her, accompanied her to chapel, and reported, sometimes without meaning to, everything they saw. There were no private conversations at court. There were only conversations that had not yet been overheard. Anne miscarried in 1534. She miscarried again in January 1536, the same month Catherine of Aragon died. The timing was catastrophic. Henry had already begun paying attention to one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. Jane was the opposite of Anne in almost every visible way. She was fair, quiet, and trained to present herself as meek. Her portraits show a woman with a round face, pale skin, and eyes that give nothing away. She wore the gable hood, the more conservative English style, rather than the French hood Anne favored. And this sartorial choice was almost certainly deliberate. She was positioning herself as a return to a simpler, less complicated kind of femininity. It worked on Henry with devastating efficiency. Anne was arrested in May 1536. She was charged with adultery, incest, and treason, charges that historians have debated for nearly 5 centuries. The evidence was, by any standard, thin. But evidence was not the point. The point was that Henry wanted to be free, and the machinery of the court was designed to give him what he wanted. Anne was executed on the Tower Green on May 19, 1536. She was approximately 35 years old. She asked that those who watched pray for the king, for he was a gentle and sovereign lord. These are the words of a woman who understood exactly what was happening and chose, in her last moment, to die without giving anyone the satisfaction of her rage. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. Jane gave Henry what Catherine and Anne had not, a son. Edward was born in October 1537. Jane died 12 days later, probably from puerperal fever. Henry wore black for 3 months. He would later claim, with the sentiment of a man who rewrites history in real time, that Jane was his true wife. He asked to be buried next to her, and he was. Henry was 36 when Jane died. He would marry 3 more times. Each marriage was different. The underlying arithmetic was the same. Anne of Cleves arrived in England in late December 1539 from the German Duchy of Cleves. The marriage had been arranged by Thomas Cromwell for political reasons. Henry needed an ally against the Catholic powers of Europe. Anne had been described favorably. Holbein had painted her portrait, and the painting was deemed pleasing. When Henry met Anne in person at Rochester, he was reportedly appalled. He called her a Flemish mare. What exactly he meant has never been entirely clear. Anne was described by others as tall, with a pleasant enough face and reserved manners, but Henry had built an entire fantasy around her painted image, and the living woman did not match it. The marriage went ahead. 6 months later, it was annulled. Anne agreed. She was given estates, a generous allowance, and the title of the king's beloved sister. She outlived Henry by 10 years, living quietly in England, apparently content. She was the only one of the 6 wives who successfully negotiated an exit. Catherine Howard was the youngest of the six. She was probably 16 or 17 when she married Henry in 1540. He was 49, obese from years of sedentary court life, and suffering from a leg wound that never healed. Catherine had grown up in the crowded household of her grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, in conditions that were, by later accounts, poorly supervised. She had been sexually manipulated by older men from a young age. When she came to Henry's attention, she was already a teenager shaped by experiences she had never chosen. She was, within the court, vivid and warm. She liked dancing. She laughed easily. She wore jewels. Henry gave her many, and she dressed in the rich fashions of the day. But she had connections in her past that the court did not forget, and the machinery that had destroyed Anne Boleyn had not been dismantled. In 1541, accusations about her past and present conduct began to circulate. She was arrested. She was executed in February 1542. She was probably 18 or 19 years old. Catherine Parr was the last. She was 31 when she married Henry in 1543, and she was by then a twice-widowed woman of intelligence and considerable education. She wore sober, rich fabrics, dark velvets, deep reds, and favored a composed, scholarly demeanor. She had been studying the Reformation privately for years. She published her own theological writing, becoming the first woman to be published under her own name in England. She was also the first queen consort to be appointed regent of England. During Henry's last French campaign in 1544, she governed the country in his name. She navigated the final years of Henry's reign with extraordinary care. He was by then volatile, in chronic pain, and prone to sudden reversals. A plot was once laid to have her arrested for heresy. She talked Henry out of it by presenting herself as seeking his masculine guidance rather than his intellectual equality. It saved her life. She understood the rules of the game, and she played them better than almost anyone. Henry died in January 1547. Catherine Parr remarried within 4 months. She died in 1548 from complications after childbirth. She was 36, 6 women, 38 years, 1 king. It would be easy to reduce these lives to the famous rhyme: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, as though the whole of a human experience can be captured in a conjugation. But what these 6 women shared was not their fates. It was the condition they all navigated. Each of them, regardless of personality or background or nationality, operated in a world that measured a woman's value in terms of her reproductive capacity, her obedience, and her proximity to a man's favor. Catherine of Aragon had been queen for 20 years. She lost everything because she could not produce a living male heir. Anne Boleyn had shaped the religious landscape of an entire nation. She was executed in 2 weeks on charges that were almost certainly fabricated. Jane Seymour is remembered primarily for dying after giving birth. Anne of Cleves was discarded because a king preferred the portrait to the person. Catherine Howard was a teenager shaped by exploitation who was then executed for it. Catherine Parr survived by being useful and careful and never too threatening. What is striking, when you sit with their histories long enough, is how much agency each of them exercised within the extraordinarily narrow space they were given. Catherine of Aragon commanded armies. Anne Boleyn negotiated for years with a king and an entire kingdom and very nearly won. Catherine Parr published books and governed a country. Anne of Cleves extracted herself from an impossible situation with grace. Even young Catherine Howard, in the accounts of those who knew her, was a full person, warm, frightened, alive, not simply a footnote to someone else's story. There are things that have changed since the 16th century, and things that have not changed nearly as much as we sometimes tell ourselves. The specific machinery is different. Women are no longer executed for failing to produce sons, no longer legally the property of their husbands. But the measurement of women according to appearance, availability, and the degree to which they make powerful men comfortable, that measurement has not entirely vanished. It has simply learned new language. What these 6 women leave behind is not only history, it is a kind of mirror. They sat in candlelit rooms, dressed in velvets and silks, calculating their next words before a king who held their lives in one hand and the fate of a kingdom in the other. They prayed and read and danced and argued and loved and strategized, and sometimes simply survived. They were individual human beings, and they were also representatives of every woman who has ever been required to be extraordinary within a world designed to make that impossible. The silence before the king enters the room has changed its form, but some version of it still exists, and the women who navigate it are still, as they have always been, paying very close attention. If there is another moment in history, another woman, another place, another century, that you would like to see reconstructed this way, leave it in the comments. These stories deserve to be heard.